What's up, Genshin YouTube? This is Benchgamer here. So today I'm going to ask a question that probably some of you have already asked yourselves at some point while playing Genshin, and that's whether or not Genshin's story is actually good or is it kinda shit. This might seem like a dumb question, maybe a controversial question, but I thought it would be a good idea to ask it now since Inazuma is, for the most part, behind us. Now, obviously, Inazuma has had its fair share of criticisms, and as some of you may know, I basically started out my channel just ranting about Inazuma's story. I was really unhappy with the way Act 3 ended. I didn't like the characterization of the Raiden Shogun, didn't like how Watatsumi Rebellion was handled, didn't like how its scenario was just off like that with no build up or, any resolution. I didn't really know what she was about, so that was kind of awful. And the plot elements were just in general introduced and dropped without really any payoff. And the general format of the way the three acts were distributed between 2.0 and 2.1 just made it seem kind of disjointed. So, like many others, I came to YouTube to vent my frustration, and that's how I started my channel, with an incoherent rant about how much I hated the Inazuma Archon quest. Then I made a slightly less ranty and incoherent video comparing what the Lirio Archon quest did right compared to what the Inazuma Archon quest did wrong, and those who watched it seemed to agree. I basically just made the video to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things, and that, the Inazuma Archon quest really did have their problems. However, one opinion that seemed to consistently pop up now and then is that the Genshin Impact story has just never been that great. And while I do believe that there was a very real drop in the quality of story writing or presentation going from the original storyline to Inazuma, that doesn't mean I fundamentally disagree with that idea that Genshin's story has just never been as good as some people may believe. I think some problems are specific to Inazuma and the post-vanilla Genshin experience, like the way the first two acts were in 2.0 and then the third act was in 2.1. And then we only got that a month later, so it just felt kind of off. And we got less content as well because there's only one act. And then we had to wait several months for the second act of Raiden's story quest, which was the real conclusion to Inazuma's story. I think that was a major reason why so many people were unhappy with how the Inazuma Archon quest ended, because they didn't really explain anything, and it wasn't a real conclusion. I have no doubt that if all that content had been released within a more reasonable time period, let's say 1 or 2 months, then the backlash would not have been anywhere as severe. Don't get me wrong, the writing still isn't what I would call brilliant, but at least it would be a more cohesive story. Other problems are just things that have existed in Genshin since the very beginning, like the overly long dialogues that often feel like they don't say anything. In fact, I'm pretty sure the writers get paid by how much they write, so they purposely extend the dialogue as much as they can. Like, no cap, I actually believe that. The lack of voiceovers for world quests also can be kind of a downer, but even with voiceovers, the dialogue can still feel drawn out. Sometimes I even skip voice dialogue and then feel a bit guilty about it afterwards because I know I can't repeat that content over again, it's just done. If I wanted to see that content again, I would literally have to go to YouTube or watch a replay of myself. So once it's done, there's no way to do it again unless I start another account. And sometimes with events, like limited events, that's just impossible. So it also doesn't help that some of the voices, especially in the English localization, are pretty odd and can be detrimental to the experience depending on your preferences. I use Chinese voices in general, so that doesn't really affect me as much. But none of this really answers why people had such high expectations for the story to begin with, and this is where I differ on the criticism of Genshin's storytelling. The really simple answer to it is that Genshin's story is, at the end of the day, a game story. It's not a book, not an anime, not a manga, and not a movie. It's not often that a game has both an interesting world and story, as well as high production values. And even though having a good story is important, that still has to be a baseline of quality in other parts of the game. And Genshin has raised that baseline far higher than its peers. Most games usually only excel in one or two aspects, not by choice, but that's how it is. And that's essentially core of why there's so much interest in Genshin, story included, because the game itself just does not have that much competition. Like, even talking strictly within the JRPG genre, I would argue the vast majority of content is still below Genshin's quality standards when you combine both story and gameplay. For whatever reason, the way Genshin mixes real-life history, mythology, and religion feels far less artificial and resonates with me more than other worlds. The inspirations of the world is recognizable, but different enough that I don't feel like I'm just playing a retelling of our own history. And even though it's complained a lot that Genshin hides its lore in the weapons and artifacts descriptions, at least they exist, right? For most games, it's just not there because nobody ever took the effort to write that stuff, but ultimately it comes back to Genshin's high production values. No doubt there are better written stories and worlds out there, but they aren't backed up by hundreds of millions of dollars in production and marketing budget. I mentioned this in my Genshin Killer video, but I feel like Genshin is a lot like World of Warcraft in a lot of ways, and this is true with its story as well. Now, obviously, World of Warcraft was extremely popular back in its day, but not because it had the most complex and most well-told story. It was because of high production values and its art style appealed to a broad range of audience. And through this massive appeal and a massive reach, a lot of people were able to consume the same story. And people share this universal world and experience that could all relate to through the gameplay. Basically, an entire generation of MMO players now had a common point of reference when it came to storytelling. And this was the same with Diablo and StarCraft for their genres as well. But the common thing they have is that none of these games have particularly deep and complex storylines, but it didn't really matter because at the end of the day, their world, gameplay, and aesthetics carried them. Vanilla WoW barely had a story. In fact, I think it's kind of like Genshin except without Archon Quest. Imagine if you were playing Genshin but with only World Quest and a bunch of people around you. So I wouldn't call them better written or more interesting than Genshin Impact either, but even these games have their own lore nerds who go around basically just reading every piece of text description for items they can find. And you know the story writing in every Blizzard game eventually turns into dog shit anyways, but nobody really can argue that. The worlds they've created are really cool, and they do have sufficient depth and lore to dig into if you really wanted. But it's not just Blizzard games that are like this either. A lot of successful modern gaming franchises have this exact same problem. Their production values are sky high, but the story is just nonsense. For example, Assassin's Creed Valhalla is universally criticized as having one of the worst stories in Assassin's Creed history, which admittedly is not like a high bar to reach, but it had record sales anyways. Kingdom Hearts, it's getting another sequel, its story is a mess. You can't convince me anybody actually understands what the fuck is going on in it. Tales of Arise is a JRPG that came out recently, also universal praise, but its story is considered one of the weakest in the franchise. Even Final Fantasy Remake, another JRPG that received really high praise, is just a riff off another game that came out decades ago, which is fine, but it's also nothing to write home about. But people still care about these games' lore. Even FPS games like Halo have their lore aficionados and people who've read every single expanded universe book ever released. And even though, most Halo fans, I bet most Halo fans have not actually read all of the books, but the people who have read the books can talk to people who've played the game about them. And that's just fine. I think that's one of the benefits of these game stories. None of these games have been original or groundbreaking in their storytelling for a very long time, if ever. You could even say the vast majority of them are just tropey bullshit, but they all still have their fan bases and lore nerds, because at the end of the day, these stories are game stories. They're there to give you a reason to do things in the game, and everything after that is just a bonus. And when you get down to the quality of the storytelling and presentation, I wouldn't even say Genshin is worse at it than some of the major franchises these days, especially JRPGs. Like, I haven't enjoyed a mainline Final Fantasy game since FF12, and that's not without trying. I've literally installed and uninstalled Final Fantasy 13 and 15 like 6 to 7 times now. The majority of them do the exact same shit as Genshin, where the dialogue is big as hell, the plot is full of assholes, or everything is just super bland and every character is a stereotype. Does that mean I enjoy no JRPGs? No, I spent over 550 hours just playing Fire Emblem Three Houses, and I loved it. But I've got to admit, I think the vast majority of JRPGs now are no better than Genshin when it comes to storytelling. Like, I give zero shits about the characters in Tales of Rise. They're all super generic, and I still had to pay $60 Canadian to play that game, in addition to the cost of a TV and an $800 PS5. The upfront cost of entry is just so fucking huge now for AAA games. And once you're done playing the game, then that's it. There's really nothing else to talk about unless there's an expansion or DLC. It's basically done. This can be a good thing or bad thing depending on where you're coming from. You might just want a good self-contained story. But I would argue that if you weren't satisfied with the story or wanted more, then you're out of luck. You might have just spent an entire day's worth of income on a game and story you didn't enjoy. And if you want more, sometimes direct sequels like Kingdom Hearts 3 don't come out for decades. And worse, sequel content sometimes isn't even on the same platform. So there's no longer a common point of reference for the fan base. It's all just spread out. In Genshin's case, in addition to being free, you also get constant story updates, new regions to explore, and new characters along with their story quests. Ever since Inazuma came out, every 2 months you get a bit more of that story, and unlike in these self-contained games, there's always the hope that the story could improve or change in the future. You can see that right now with Inazuma, so even though I still think it was badly paced and poorly written, the second Brighton story quest did end things on a high note for me, and outside the Archon quest, I highly enjoyed Inazuma for what it is, and it was all free. So could things have been better? Yeah, and they can be because the game's not finished yet. Will the story be better in Sumeru? I don't know, but that's also part of what makes the game so addictive and what keeps the conversation going. The reason why I made this video is because when I read the comments about how the story was never good, I did find myself agreeing with them in part. There are all sorts of contrivances and assholes to explain how the Traveler went at the end of the day, and how the Archons lost their Gnosis because the format of the game requires them to, or why nobody says jack shit about Conria and knows anything about the sister. But then I realized that even though I do agree, I am still thinking about Genshin's story all the time. I still watch videos about Genshin's lore every so often, I still come back to play this game every day, and I still look forward to the next story update, even though Inazuma burned me in its last act. No matter what I think about the presentation of the story, the world of Teyvat itself is just really, really cool. It's like that dream child of Breath of the Wild and The Last Airbender. I just like every time I play this game and spend my resin and then I'm done with it, I still want to play this game. I just run around in the world not really knowing what to do, and I'm like, no, I don't want to leave, please, I don't want to leave. People want to stay in this world and experience more of it. The lore and idea of Teyvat itself is bigger than the story now, and I think that is an achievement of the storytelling. Like World of Warcraft, Harry Potter, Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, and all these other popular franchises, the story was always kind of basic once you get down to it. Like, there's good versus bad and about 30 different variations of that same story, but that was never why these popular franchises became popular in the first place. Like, you can't tell me Boba Fett did anything worth the shit in the movies, but people managed to make a cult following out of him anyways. It's just called the rule of cool. Sometimes the idea is far bigger than what is actually shown, and the world becomes the attraction rather than the narrative. I never really wanted to be the main character or the person who saved the world in these stories. I just wanted to be in the world and see how it worked. And I think Genshin Impact is in that same situation now, where I'm not that invested in what is going on with the Traveler, but I do like the world building, and I like seeing how these different societies work in Teyvat, and I like seeing the characters in them. But by virtue of how popular the game is, there's always somebody to talk to about these new developments, and there's a common point of reference that we can all share because we play the same game. I'm not expecting anything brilliant from the Archon quests, but they can still be pretty entertaining, and that's really all they need to be. And again, I do think that Inazuma's story ended on a high note for me, and I am looking forward to Sumeru. Whether or not Hoyoverse can avert some of the past criticisms with the Inazuma plotline remains to be seen, and I'm not necessarily hopeful that they will, but at least after Inazuma, I now know like how they distribute the story between patches. So maybe I won't get too angry this time if the Archon quests turn out to not wrap things up as nicely as I want them to. And even if I do get angry, I can always just like make a video out of it, so that's great too. Anyways, this is Bench Gamer signing out.